from Sydney, Australia. My name is Dr. Kristy Goodwin, and I am delighted to be literally zooming in to wherever you are watching. I think we would all agree that the last 12, possibly 18 months have really been challenging for all of us, whether you're a parent or a professional, or possibly trying to be a combination of both. The last year has presented some really unique challenges. One of the challenges I experienced as a parent in the middle of the pandemic was when I was trying to work from home with kids. And anyone who attempted to undertake that mammoth undertaking knows how challenging that could be. But I made the fatal error one day of thinking that I had nailed it as a mum. I had my laptop set up, ready to do a Zoom call with a big corporate client. I have 3 children. Ranging in age from 10 to 2. And when I opened the lid on the laptop, prior to opening the lid on the laptop, I'd said to the older 2 children, I need you to do they were doing their remote learning or their home learning, and they were set up on each of their own laptops. And thank goodness for technology to facilitate online learning. So they opened up their laptops, ready to do their independent work. And I'd given them the brief that mummy cannot be interrupted under any circumstances. You need to pretend like you're not here and just work silently. And all was going well. And I made that mistake of giving myself an internal high five. I thought, you've got this, mum. And so the older 2 were doing their work on their laptop, and the toddler had been set up with some play equipment nearby. And I'd said to the older 2 boys, under no circumstances can you interrupt mummy. So midway through the presentation, after I'd given myself that virtual high five, the toddler took it upon himself to climb up onto the table behind the laptop where I was presenting. His older 2 brothers attempted, rather unsuccessfully, to try and wrestle him silently off the table. And anyone with boys knows that is a mammoth undertaking as well. They failed. Not only did he push his older 2 brothers out of the way, but he stood up again on the other side of this Zoom call where I was still presenting and pretending that none of this was happening. And he proceeded to remove his nappy and do a poo on the top of the dining table where I was working. So when people say 2020 was a shit show, I am here to tell you I was living through that experience live on camera, having to pretend that it wasn't happening. So if you're a parent, I understand some of the digital dilemmas and the issues that you have faced. And I'm here today to share with you some science-backed solutions. This is not a message about banning technology. I often say digital amputation is not the solution. Whether we love it or loathe it, technology is here to stay. And I think the pandemic made us realize just how reliant on technology we are, especially for our children and our what I call screenagers. It is their portal. It is their portal for leisure, and it is their portal for learning. It is their portal for connection. And so our job as parents, educators, and caregivers is to help our children harness the positive potential that technology offers, whilst at the same time mitigating some of its potential pitfalls. And that's what I'm keen to share with you today. So we are raising kids whose childhood and adolescence looks so very different to our own. We have children that learn to tap, swipe, and pinch before they've learned to ride a bike, grip a pencil, or tie their shoelaces. Kids that don't know what delayed gratification is. Do you remember years gone by when you had to wait for the internet to dial up? Do you remember this sound? Anyone remember that sound? We are raising kids who are being thrust in the digital age. They're being dunked in the digital stream at earlier and earlier ages. And if this technology is not being used intentionally, if it's being used excessively or inappropriately, then technology can certainly derail and damage our children's development. But the reality is that it's here to stay. So we need to teach our children how to use technology. Now, as somebody who researches and studies this topic, I'm the first to say I am not a parenting expert. I think those 2 words are an oxymoron. Anyone who suggests that they are an expert at parenting is duping you. And here is a screenshot to provide further evidence. So my research looks at the neuroscience, psychology, and the intersection with technology. And I want to share with you an accident that I had. I left my mobile phone unlocked very briefly, might I add, while I went to the bathroom. My 4-year-old son, Billy, found my mobile phone and he changed my Google ID and my Apple ID to the name Stinky Bum Bum. Now, I was oblivious to this. I was sitting in a television studio just about to do an interview on children and screen time. And the producer said, I need to airdrop some graphics to you, Kristy, for your approval. But she said, I can't find your name in the list of users. And so I quickly checked my settings, and to my horror, I was mortified to see that my Google ID had been changed from Kristy Goodwin to the very embarrassing name Stinky Bum Bum. Now, I'd also been oblivious to this earlier that morning when I'd been replying to a journalist in Australia here, answering questions about kids and screen time, and my emails were coming also from Stinky Bum Bum. So I am not the perfect parent, and I'm not here to shoot on parents. My mission instead is to arm parents with research-based information so they can make educated and informed decisions how they best navigate this digital terrain without relying on digital abstinence. I want to share a quick video with you. So I get emotional every time I watch that video, and I hope it was audible from where you are tuning in. And this is my life's work. I'm on a mission to help people thrive in the digital landscape. Whether you're a parent or a professional, I believe that many of us are a slave to the screen, and we need to flip that, where we can certainly use technology and use it to our advantage so that we are a master of the technology. And I want to share a story with you. I don't often share this story, and I do get quite emotional. But the reason that I began this work, so my work initially began studying the impact that technology was having on children and adolescents, particularly on their brains and bodies, drawing on neuroscience and psychology. And I had been kindly invited back in the days when we used to travel to speak at a conference for Apple in Singapore. And I had left my middle son, Billy, at for 2 nights. It was the first time we'd been apart, and I had gone and presented. And I landed back in Sydney and did what most people did at the baggage carousel. I pulled out my phone to check my emails. And to my shock horror, there were 72 emails that had landed between the flight from Singapore back to Sydney. This was pre-Wi-Fi days on flights. And I had that horrible sinking feeling. I often call it email apnea. We know we hold our breath, we dump a whole lot of cortisol, and our heart rate accelerates when we dive into our inboxes. So I made the decision in the taxi that I would try and triage my inbox. But I got in the taxi and was tired and actually fell asleep on the taxi ride back to my house. So when I arrived home and was greeted by Billy, we'd been apart for 2 nights, he needed some extra mum cuddles, some topping up of his love tank. So the expected nap time that he was going to have, where I was supposed to be taking a conference call, I knew wasn't going to happen. So I had to quickly cancel a meeting that had been scheduled during his nap time. And I opened the lid of my laptop and I saw that awful red icon declaring that not only did I have 72 unread emails, it had now increased to 147 emails. And I had that horrible sinking feeling. I opened the lid on my laptop to send one email to cancel the conference call that I'd scheduled during his anticipated nap time. And that awful red icon dragged me into the digital rabbit hole. I don't know about you, but if you've ever been sucked into the digital vortex, I know I have. And so I went in to try and triage my inbox, and I got digitally distracted. Now, Billy was near me and he was climbing on the lounge. And in the space of a couple of minutes, whilst I was digitally distracted, Billy fell from the top of the lounge onto the floor and smashed his face open. What you're seeing on the screen here is actually after hospitalization. This was the continual bleeding that occurred after we had been to the hospital, to the emergency department for treatment. And I am filled with mother's guilt. Every time I see this image, I get pangs of mother's guilt. But this was the moment in time where it really forced me to examine my digital behaviors. For so long, and I think as a society, we have been preoccupied with talking about kids and teens and managing their screen time. And the whole time, I believe, we have been oblivious to our digital habits as adults and caregivers. We're the ones that are tethered to screens. We're the ones that haven't been in control of technology. We're the ones that are left feeling distracted, dependent, disconnected, and depleted because of our digital behaviors. So I share this from a personal experience. I believe we need to talk about how can we use technology, but use it in healthy and helpful ways. So I think most of us agree that technology is an integral part of all of our lives. If you were to ask your screenagers, are these their 3 greatest fears in life? They would probably say an emphatic yes. The low Wi-Fi signal, the low battery signal, and the spinning wheel of death. But today I'm going to challenge you. We need to think about our children's screen habits, but we also need to examine our own. Are we the ones that are distracted by technology? And so today I'm going to challenge you to think about what I'm sharing in terms of your children and your adolescents and their digital behaviors, but also invite you to reflect on your own digital behaviors as well. So one of the reasons that we are struggling in this digital landscape is because the technology is changing and growing at exponential rates. Does anyone remember one of these? Do you remember when we had floppy disks, the real floppy disks? I was in a year 3 classroom a couple of years ago, and a boy called Ben came in Monday morning. I was doing a research visit, and he came in wielding a floppy disk, and he said to his teacher, "Mrs. White, can I do special news today?" And she said, "Of course, Ben." And Ben proceeded to get up in front of his year 3 peers and present them with a floppy disk. And Ben said, I had to go and tidy my dad's office on the weekend, and it was so boring until I found one of these. And he held it closer to his peers, and there were oohs and ahs and bewilderment at what this strange thing was. And Ben proceeded to tell his year 3 classmates that this strange looking device, he said, "I can't believe it." He said, "I had to tidy my dad's office and it was so boring until I found this. I can't believe my dad has used the 3D printer and he has printed out the save button." I'll let that one land for a moment, because that is exactly what Ben, as a year 3 student, a grade 3 student, thought this was. For Ben, he has never saved his work to a USB or to a disk, let alone a floppy disk. And so Ben had experienced a world where he saved his work to a cloud. And so because the technology is growing and evolving and changing at exponential rates, many parents and caregivers are feeling ill-equipped to navigate this digital terrain. Many of us are abdicating responsibility, saying, I don't understand the technology. I don't understand this. Why are they taking strange looking selfies and applying filters? And because the world is so very different to our childhood, our natural tendency, as always has been the case when any new technology is introduced to society, is for us to have some moral panic, for us to fret and demonize it. But I invite you today for us to assume a more positive role. We don't have a frame of reference because this is what childhood looked like being online for most of us. But today, this is what childhood and adolescence looks like online. And so whilst we might not have a frame of reference, our parents' digital dilemma that they faced may have been this. They may have only worried about what television shows we could watch. And there were usually scheduled times of the day when services were available for children and young people. But today, technology is 24/7. We have universal access to it. And so as parents, we're trying to navigate this terrain. And so I understand why some parents want to ban technology, why we demonize it, or we tell children and adolescents that it's something that is toxic or taboo. But the reality is that it is here to stay. And so I believe the core message is that if we want our children to foster healthy and helpful relationships with technology, we have to be the pilot of the digital plane, not the passenger. We need parents and caregivers sitting in the pilot seat of the digital plane so that when our young people hit digital turbulence, when they see something inappropriate, when they're a victim of cyberbullying, when they're exposed to pornography, when they see something violent, aggressive, or socially inappropriate, if we are in the pilot seat, we can help them to course correct. And to be the pilot of the digital plane, you don't have to have technical prowess. You've got to get 3 Bs right. And the 3 Bs are that we need parents who are the pilots of the plane to establish boundaries, not on our children, but with our children. We need to be sitting side by side with them, helping to establish boundaries, and boundaries beyond how much screen time. I know this is controversial to say this, but I actually believe the notion of screen time will soon become obsolete because we've got artificial intelligence, we've got wearable technologies, virtual reality. The notion of a screen is going to become obsolete. The other reason I think we need to stop obsessing and just having boundaries around one metric. Time is not the only metric. Yes, how much is important, and especially as it affects the next B, but focusing exclusively on how much time children are having is only one piece of the puzzle. So we need to establish boundaries around more than just how much. We need to establish boundaries around what. I believe that's the big lever that we can pull. What are they using? Is it age appropriate? Is it developmentally appropriate? Is it active? Is it passive? Is it, are they leisure or learning? So we need to focus on what. We also need to focus on where are the no-go tech zones in your house? Bedrooms and bathrooms are 2 big ones, and meal areas. We also need to establish who they're interacting with and when they're interacting with them. And how they're using them. We know our children and our teenagers, our screenagers, digital behaviours are having a significant impact on their physiological and psychological well-being. And so we'll talk about that as well. We need to make sure that we are protecting their basic needs. We need to ensure that their time online isn't eroding their basic physical and psychological needs. In particular, we need to focus on making sure they're getting enough movement, enough sleep, and enough interaction with real people in real time. And the third B, and this one is probably the most onerous one in a digital world, is we need to ensure that our children are bored. Yes, and many of these apply to us. We need to establish that they have opportunities for digital disconnection. So I'm often asked, what is it about the online world that's so captivating? Why is it that our young people would rather have a broken bone rather than a broken phone? What is it that draws our kids in, that makes them become that digital zombie? And there are three big reasons. Hint, hint, many of these reasons also apply to us as adults. It helps us to explain why we are tethered to technology, why we find it hard to shut the lid on the laptop, why we keep scrolling through social media or binge watching Netflix. So the first reason is because the online world that we all use for leisure or learning has been intentionally designed to tap into our three most basic psychological drivers. As humans, we are hardwired for relational connection. We want to be part of a tribe. And this is why an event like this, World Unity Week, is so appealing, because we get to connect and be with others, even if virtually. Does this help you understand why multiplayer video games, social media, community streaming services are so popular? It taps into that desire to be part of the group. The second need that we have as humans is the need for competency. And in the online world, our young people have a perceived sense of competency and they get tangible measures. Social media vanity metrics for our older people. We have got boys that are telling us one of the reasons that they love gaming is because it's one of the only times in the day where they're told they're doing a good job. They get tangible measures of their success. They know how many battles they've won, how much ammunition they've acquired. And the third reason, so they've got connection, competence, and the third reason is that they're craving control. They want to feel like they have some autonomy. And when they're online, they're the ones making the choices. They choose what they watch next on Netflix or YouTube. And we know that choice is determined by often recommendation algorithms. The second reason, so the first reason is that the online world taps into our psychological needs. The second reason that the online world becomes so compelling, some people might use the word addictive, is because when we're online, it causes neurobiological changes. When we're online, our brain is giving us hits of dopamine. Every like and comment, watching silly things on YouTube or streaming services, online activities for our young people are usually pleasurable. So their brain is secreting this dopamine neurotransmitter, which makes them crave more and more of it. Now, the problem with dopamine is that dopamine floods their prefrontal cortex. And this part of the brain, that prefrontal cortex, is responsible for self-regulation. It is the impulse control center. So when we are doing things online and we're getting these squirts of dopamine, it literally overrides that logical part of the brain that would otherwise say that is a sufficient quantity. So when parents have expectations that their kids are going to be playing a video game or scrolling through social media or watching, YouTube clips and turn it off and go and set the dinner table, that is a completely unrealistic expectation when you know what's happening with that dopamine supply. We also know when they're online, a whole lot of other things are happening. One of the reasons we experience, and tell me if you're a parent, you've experienced the dreaded techno tantrum. This is when your otherwise fairly well emotionally adjusted child combusts when we digitally disconnect them. One of the reasons is often because their sensory and their nervous system gets overstimulated online, especially if they're watching or playing rapid fire, fast-paced screens. And so what's happening is when they're coming off the screen, they are discharging the cortisol that has built up in their body. We also know when they're online, they often become a digital zombie. When they're so engrossed with what they're doing, so enraptured that you could be naked and on fire behind them and they'd still be oblivious doing their digital pursuits. This is no accident. This is because game developers actually make background music in children's apps and websites very hypnotic and repetitive to lull children into this flow state where they become enraptured and engrossed. So the third reason, we've talked about psychological drivers, we've talked about the neurobiological changes. The third reason, I'm going to deflect some responsibility here to the tech companies, is because the technologies we all use, the technologies our kids use, particularly for their leisure time, the technologies even we use for our work, have some very persuasive design techniques. For anyone who has watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix, you'll be aware of some of these techniques. One of the chief ones that our kids struggle with is that the online world is always new, it's always interesting, and it requires very little mental effort on my behalf. So I can very easily get what we call quick dopamine because I can tap and swipe and pinch and see something new and interesting. Why I'm going to prescribe a good dose of boredom. The big reason that our kids particularly find it hard to switch off, and why we do as well, is because when we're online, we enter something called the state of insufficiency. We never feel done. We never feel complete. There's always another level I can get to. There's always another refresh of social media. There's always another email in my inbox. And so the online world is a bottomless bowl. Now, this is compounded by techniques like the color choice of notification bubbles. Have you ever paused to stop and ponder why your notification bubble is usually red? Red is associated with urgency and importance. The fact that we get metrics, I knew my emails had gone from 72 to 147. That number is a driver to make you use it more and more. And so there's a whole host of deliberate design techniques that get our kids hooked and conditioned to being tethered to technology. So our kids really need us to be the pilot, and they need us to establish those boundaries. Boundaries around how much is most certainly important. I'm not suggesting that we give our young people opportunity to determine their own limits, because knowing about their delayed prefrontal cortex development and knowing about some of the persuasive design techniques, it means our kids need us to be that pilot, to put in place the parameters, but to do so with them, not on them. I don't believe presenting kids with a digital contract is the way to go, unless they've had some buy-in as to what the terms and conditions are on that contract. And we need our boundaries to consider more than just screen time. As I said before, we need to consider what, when, where, how they're using them, and with whom they're using them as well. So when it comes to their basic needs, kids have basic psychological and physical needs for optimal well-being. The neuroscience, developmental psychology very clearly tells us that young people's needs, psychological and physical needs, haven't shifted. We have a fairly predictable set of requirements that children need for optimal brain development. They need movement, they need play, they need interaction with real people, they need sufficient amounts of sleep, they need good quality nutrition, and they need to hear and use lots of language, ping pong interaction. But I think we would all agree that our digital behaviors are impacting and sometimes displacing some of these needs. And many countries throughout the world are experiencing significant issues at the moment with mental health. And this is partly, in part, due to the pandemic. But this was an issue for many of our young people prior to the pandemic, and it has certainly been amplified during the pandemic. And I believe, and the research is corroborating this slowly, that our digital behaviors are in part why we have seen this increase in mental health issues, and not in the way we might predict. Many people are quick to point the finger and say the reason we've got mental health issues is because of smartphones and social media. And yes, there is research that definitely shows us a correlation. The time when smartphones and social media became more prevalent in young people's lives was also the time where we started to see a spike in poorer mental health outcomes. But this research does not prove causation. It shows correlation. And so we have to be careful about prematurely blaming technology. We don't yet know, is it the chicken or the egg? Is that young people with existing mental health issues gravitate to the online world as a form of escapism or coping mechanism? Or is it the other way around, where technology is adversely impacting them? And I believe it is a combination of both. I actually believe, in the research, as I said, is starting to corroborate this. It is not necessarily the screen or social media or gaming per se that is having a detrimental impact. It is what those pursuits are displacing. And I believe it is the displacement of some of our young people, and this applies to us as adults, some of our fundamental physical and psychological needs. The first need that I think helps to explain why we're seeing a deterioration in mental health is because of sleep. And our screen habits are certainly adversely impacting both the amount, so the quantity, but also the quality of sleep. We know that blue light stops the body making melatonin, which is the sleep hormone. Insufficient melatonin results not only in sleep delays, so taking us longer to fall asleep, but also shortens some of our deep sleep state, that state of sleep where we need to be backing up our memories, memory consolidation. And so we know many people, and the data globally corroborates this, many people, both children and adults and teenagers, are not getting adequate amounts or good quality of sleep. We also know that our tech time is making us more sedentary than ever before, and physical movement is absolutely critical for our physiological well-being, but also for our mental health. When we move, we make dopamine and serotonin and endocannabinoids, all of these positive neurotransmitters that we need to help us feel good and also look good as well. Firmly believe that our relationships are being impacted by technology, both relationships among children and teenagers, but also relationships between parents and caregivers. Researchers are colloquially referring to this as tech neglect or digital abandonment. And it's this idea that parents and caregivers are being tethered to their screen and not having the incidental moments of connection, the micro moments of connection with their kids, because they are digitally distracted. A mum came to a seminar of mine a couple of months ago, and she came up afterwards and she said, "Kristy, I need to tell you this sad story." And she said, "I gave me permission to share it in other ways." And she said, "My daughter came home from school one day and she said, 'Mum, how much do you earn per hour?'" And the mum thought, this is a strange question for my daughter to ask. And she explained, "I earn a salary. I need to do some calculations." But she said, "I can let you know." And later that night, when she was tucking her daughter into bed, she told her that she'd done some calculations, and she said, "This is how much I earn per hour." And she said, "Why do you ask?" And her daughter turned to her mum and she said to her mum, "Because I want to buy an hour of your time without your phone." Ouch. I'm not for a moment suggesting that we should never use technology around our kids. They need to see us use it, but they also need to see us switch it off. We need to be good digital role models. Our kids have mirror neurons in their brain. This means that they emulate, they copy what we do. And so if we're calling out from behind our smartphone or the lid of the laptop or the tablet to turn off their device, but we are connected, then we're not being good role models. So as pilots of the plane, we have to establish those boundaries with our kids. We have to protect and preserve their basic needs. And the last thing is, we need them to look like this every now and then. They need to know what it's like for everything not to be instantly gratifying, to be new and exciting. They need to cope with big emotions rather than being satisfied with a screen. We know many people are self-soothing with a screen, and so we need our kids to unplug. It is where creative ideas come up, where they solve problems, where they get a sense of who they are and what makes them tick. Really important that we cultivate boredom. And a study was done a couple of years ago because we have lost the art of boredom as adults. A study was done and they put participants in a room and said, "Look, just sit there and be bored for 15 minutes. Now, as a mum whose kids still put their fingers underneath the bathroom door, the idea of sitting in my room, in a room solo, sounds like utopia, but I didn't participate in this study. The researchers had to prematurely end the study because the participants showed signs of psychological distress. They became agitated and upset, being bored for 15 minutes. So they went back to their ethics committee and they asked for permission to conduct iteration 2 of the study. And in iteration 2, they gave participants the option of self-administering a small electric shock. What they found was that 69% of males, 24% of females gave themselves a mild electric shock in lieu of being bored. We have lost the art of mind wandering, of daydreaming, and it is critical for our well-being and our health. And so my mission is to help you thrive in the digital world. Technology is here to stay, and it is an integral part of our lives as adults, but it also is and will continue to be for our children and for our screenagers. We need to help all of us tame technology so that we are not a slave to the screen. We need to use it in empowering and enriching ways. Use it in ways like we are today to connect on World Unity Week, to share powerful messages and connect and drive in important collaborations. But in order to do this, our kids need to use technology, and they need us as their parents and caregivers to be that pilot of the digital plane. Thank you for your time and attention. It has been a delight to speak with you, and I look forward to other opportunities where we can possibly connect online. Thank you.